Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Free Thought Forum presented by the Pennsylvania Nonbelievers. I'm your host for tonight, Jacob, and once again, I'm joined by Doug.
Yes, my twin brother with the longer hair was here last week, but I've taken over for him, so just call me Doug the Second.
Anyway.
All right, anyway.
Anyway, that's about all you can say to a statement like that. Anyway.
And don't forget that this is June the 27th, 2016. Or was it 17? 17.
Yes.
Retirement has really gotten
Yeah,
to
we're
Yes,
off to a
it
great
really
start
has.
here, but
I used to lose days and maybe hours, but now I'm losing years.
it happens.
Yes.
It really does happen. First up tonight, I'd like to remind you that we still have some conference tickets available for this year's conference in October, which will be taking place in Philadelphia. We even have a few VIP tickets still available and some great speakers in the lineup. Probably our headline is going to be Lawrence Krauss, a physicist, has written more books than I can name right now, and is definitely a lot of fun to listen to. He's a very entertaining speaker and very, very informative on some very complex sciences like quantum physics, particle physics, and has written a lot on the origin of the universe. We also will have David Silverman, the president of American Atheists, Yvette Dietrich, a.k.a. the Science Babe. So lots of scientists in the lineup tonight for this. Also, Hemant Mehta, who's a.k.a. the Friendly Atheist. He's a blogger. Sometimes we get our material from him for the show, so he definitely puts a lot of information out there. Not just him, but also he has, like most blogs, they have various contributors to it. Just he's the main source.
And a lot of comments written in, too.
Yeah. And so it should be a great show, great weekend there. Also, as a reminder, we are having our Atheist Fights Hunger food drive for this conference again this year. Still looking for a few donations, and every little bit helps. And every 25 cents will be one meal donated to a food bank in central Pennsylvania, or I don't know which food bank it's going to go to this year, but it'll be, you can make a little bit of money go a long way.
For the people that are hungry.
Yeah. But the first major story came out within the last couple of days is a Supreme Court decision which has troubling implications for the separation of church and state. This was a Lutheran church in Missouri applied for a grant to resurface a playground, and Missouri turned them down, even though they would have qualified for other reasons. They would have qualified. Their state constitution does not allow money going to churches. And Pennsylvania also has that, and we actually have that in our own state constitution. And unfortunately, the Supreme Court voted 7-2 in favor of the church to receive the grant money. And this drew. Now, the two dissenting were Sotomayor and Ginsburg. Now, Sotomayor wrote the dissent and was very, very upfront about how mad she was about it. She's been a very staunch advocate for the separation of church and state over the years, and sees this as just a blatant disregard for it.
Trying to slip in the back doors.
Yeah. And the thing is there were certain various precedents they tried to cite, or other people tried to cite. For example, they talked about faith-based initiatives which do allow money to go to churches, but the problem is those faith-based initiatives, the church still has to make a pledge not to use the money for use of evangelizing to people. which the church in question made no such pledge. And if you look at their mission statements and some of the other programs they run, they're obviously not going to do that. And I should also point out, too, as far as I could tell, the playground was on church property. So it's not like it doesn't sound like it was that publicly. As far as I could tell, the public use was minimal, where it was sort of part of a daycare that they were using for a church-run daycare as well. So it's hard to imagine this playground would be used anything other than sort of a way to attract people to the church. And that's the thing when we get into some of these where maybe the thing by itself might seem like you might be able to make an argument for it, but it's hard to really separate that out entirely. Such as, how would they use this use this thing they're putting money into to bring more people into the church, and that's ultimately their goal anyway. And that's one of the things I've noticed a lot in recent years is they've been beaten in the courts time and time again as far as not being able to get funding, although recently they've been starting to win a few. And I think some of that is due to their issues like this, where they try to rebrand the whole thing as having a secular purpose. We saw the same thing with the Ark Encounter project, where if you hear them talk publicly, they're very careful to try to make it sound like, oh, this is going to be an attraction that's good for the economy. Give all these secular reasons for trying to obtain grant money for these projects, but obviously there's an underlying religious purpose. And I would say that's kind of that's what makes talking about these so frustrating, is when they're very careful to craft their words and their deals carefully, so that it's hard to challenge them directly on the merit, but everyone knows what's going on between the lines. And I think that's why you have to sometimes really take a hard stand on this. And one other thing that was mentioned in the dissent was the grant project, the way the grant program was set up. It would actually, if you extend it to churches, it's actually going to favor larger churches.
Which is something we don't need.
What's that say?
That's something that they don't need.
Yeah. Yes, and it could qualify as excessive entanglement under the Lemon test. And so it's, that's one of the consequences of this. And, we could also talk about all the other tax incentives churches already get. What do they need grant money for? Yeah. But, even the thing is even the people who wrote in the justices who wrote in favor of it, even they kind of realized they were treading into some dangerous waters here, because near the end of their conclusion, at some point in the decision, they actually tried to say this decision doesn't apply. The things we talk about in this decision don't apply outside this decision, which I don't know of too many Supreme Court decisions you can honestly say that about.
So, viewers, don't forget that this is a live call-in show. We'd like to get your opinion on what we're talking about. The phone number is on the screen. As you can see, it's a local number. And give us a call if you differ.
Yeah. But, so, it's hard to say where it's going to go from here, especially with religion controlling much of government right now, and quite a few Supreme Court justices might be up in the next couple of years. It's going to be quite troubling coming for the next couple of years to see how these decisions are going to go, especially since this one wasn't even close, a 7-2 decision. And you're probably going to see a swing in the balance of power coming up, and you'll probably see a number of decisions that were 5-4 against religions now going in their favor. And of course, when you do that, it's going to be just encourage more people to take more chances. And
and the trouble is, you can't catch all the people that are taking these chances. Sometimes it's a once in a lifetime spot, and you get your point in, and it's too late for anyone to complain about it.
Yeah, that's the thing. And that's the one thing they take advantage of a lot of times is whenever they'll go through with something and just figure no one's going to complain.
Yeah.
That's something, and actually I've read quite a few stories this week about Ten Commandments monuments going up on Capitol lawns or crosses going certain places where they really shouldn't. And it's definitely hard to catch all of them, and there's not enough. I know, things, people like the FFRF and Americans United for the Separation of Church and State always have their hands full trying to go after these, but it's just there's so many to go after. I know the FFRF sends out hundreds of letters a year that are telling people, no, you can't do that. Now, usually, actually, quite a high percentage of those come back and they do get resolved with just a letter.
Yeah. But, it's a lot easier for people to say, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know that, than to get permission.
Right. Yeah, there's always that. Or at this point, they have to know. You have to think. And a lot of them just don't care. One disturbing bill that was introduced in Pennsylvania not too long ago, I don't think it went anywhere, but one thing somebody tried to do was make it so that minors who were suing against religious symbols on public property could not file anonymously, was what the aim of the bill was. And it was obviously an attempt to just intimidate people to not complain about it. And the fact that it was the bill specifically stated, if you're suing about religious symbols and nothing else, that you couldn't file anonymously.
Well, the trouble is that anyone that complains about this is going to get labeled one of those atheists.
Right.
And there's plenty of religious people out there that have the same view. They want to keep state and religion separate, but they don't want to be labeled as one of those dreaded atheists.
Yeah, I mean that's you do see a lot of Christians and other religious people on the side of separation of church and state. It's kind of reminded me of a Supreme Court decision in the early 90s where one of the justices ruled against a religion trying to get religious exemptions for religious beliefs, and the justice writing the opinion, explaining the decision said something like, you can't have that much influence over law or people, because religious beliefs are just whatever people have, and it would make people basically their own law unto themselves. Now, that was actually written by, of all people, Anthony Scaley, who would say that about other religions but not his own. But when he was talking about other religions, he knew perfectly well why this was why this was an issue. But of course, when it came to his own, he obviously ruled in favor of them. But yeah, it is. There's actually a great video on YouTube called "Violence in Defense of Christian Privilege" by Ed Braden, where he just goes through all the different times where people who have filed suits about religious symbols on public property have faced discrimination, have been bullied, harassed, assaulted at times. Someone had their house burned down once. it was, it's terrible. But I mean, but to be fair, you're right. There are a lot of religious people who don't stand for that, and who will stand up for the separation of church and state because they realize, if you have government enforcing, religious conformity, well, how deep does that go? Obviously, they're trying to be as general as possible right now, but you don't know how specific it's going to get. I know when I've heard about when JFK was running for president, everyone was concerned that if you put a Catholic in charge, he's going to make us all Catholics.
Yeah.
So that's,
I remember that from the JFK election.
yes, and that's why you saw John F. Kennedy kind of making a lot of statements sort of pro-separation of church and state, and kind of keeping his Catholicism at a distance because of everyone's paranoia about it.
Yeah, the Pope doesn't, he's not the president.
Yeah, and that's the thing. It's like there's so much division within Christianity. You can't say there's just one. I mean, like there's a lots of feuds between, say, Southern Baptists and Pentecostals, and others, and other religious groups I've heard recently have called for the banning of Jehovah's Witnesses, which maybe there's an argument for that.
Or there should be a law that says that if they come to your door and they say, "Hi, I'm for," you have a right to say, "Get lost," and have them go away.
I have heard too that originally, when they were writing the Constitution, that one of the main proponents of that, what we now call separation of church and state, was indeed various religions, because they were afraid that a state religion would be set up and it would wipe them out of existence. So they wanted that. That was pushed by I believe it was a Baptist, one of the Baptist church at that time.
Yeah.
But it's something to think about. The start of that whole thing was where the religions didn't want to be allowed to be affected by the U.S. government.
Yeah, because then sometimes if the government goes down, then so does the religion. Or if people rebel against the government, they rebel against the religion. I mean, that's kind of what happened with ancient paganism, was when you had the fall of the Roman Empire, it really drug its gods down with it. And it's and there are there are a lot of religious people who don't want the government involved. Which kind of brings a next topic, where an Arizona state representative, Athena Solomon, gave a secular invocation a couple months ago, and then you had there was a Christian representative who came in there and kind of during the session and kind of chastised her and quote unquote corrected her, and apparently she's gotten a lot of positive feedback on social media, which is surprising. You get anything positive on social media anymore. But a lot of people supporting her, both secular and religious, about having a secular invocation, and the statement she gave was very inclusive. It was very very much remember who we serve, and to do the best we can for the people of Arizona. And it's very much like what we're going through here in Pennsylvania, where we have our own lawsuit proceeding against the State House of Representatives, trying to give a similar invocation, and we got denied for explicitly religious reasons. And when it went to the papers, we got a lot of positive feedback too, of people saying, "Yeah, go ahead with the suit. This is something we should definitely go through with." And when you start to be out and more open about it, you'd be surprised at how many times you get positive feedback especially when you don't expect it. I know when I wrote a pro-atheist letter to the editor a couple of years ago, I was sitting there like, okay, am I going to get run out of town? I got to get, got to have my escape plan ready. But no, I got so much positive feedback about it. I didn't know what to do with it. And
it kind of makes a smile on your face. See, I'm not alone. I'm not alone.
Yeah, and actually, I had the experience when I'm running for borough council of my hometown this year, and I was outside the polling place for the primary, and I had somebody come up to me and say, "Didn't you write a letter to the editor a couple years ago?" And I'm like, "Oh no, oh no,
oh it's coming back to haunt me."
But no, they're like, "No, it's a good letter. I agree with you." And I'm like, "Oh, cool."
You don't know how to answer when they come on like that, and you go, "Oh, are they going to shoot me? Are they going to beat me up? Or are they going to agree with me?"
Yeah, and actually, another PA Non-Believers member who was running for office in a nearby town also had this kind of the same experience that I did, where it was like they were like, "Hey, you were with them," and like she's like, "Oh yeah." And then they're like, "Oh, good, you got my vote."
But it doesn't it kind of prove that there is power in those letters to the editor. You know, you think, I'm just writing a letter and no one's going to see it. I'll put my comments out there and no one will know about it. And then all of a sudden someone approaches you and say, "Hey, didn't you write that letter?"
Yeah, and apparently my mother said like the week after I wrote it that people kept coming up to her and asking, "Is this your son?"
Yeah.
I'm like, yeah, but they're like, "Oh, it's a good letter." Even those who disagreed with me were like, "Yeah, it was pretty well written." But
she didn't go, "My son is dead to me."
no, I never did that. I mean, we do still have conversations about it from time to time. She recently sent me an article asking my thoughts on it, and it was actually kind of a decent article talking about, how much Christianity forces conformity, where someone was just kind of trying to rethink how they conceptualize the whole idea of God, and just that alone got people really mad at her and very suspicious. Let alone, I mean, she wasn't even questioning the existence of God or anything. It's just, how do I think about my own concept? And you do that, and everybody's like, "What are you doing? What are you doing?" And I know growing up, I had that same issue where it was, if you could not question church authority, and that's probably why we have so many denominations throughout Christianity, is because nobody wants you to question their own authority. There's no give and take.
Yeah.
So everyone has to go out and find exactly the one they want.
Yeah, and no one is going to necessarily agree with everything that your church supports. So we'll just invent a church and say everything that we want.
Yeah, and that's something interesting to think about. Is you force conformity, it can actually cause division. And that's one thing I definitely agreed about that was kind of hinted at in the article she sent me. And another thing they were talking about too is how little modern day Christianity is really like what it was back, when it first started. And that was an issue I had too when I was growing up. I was like, we have so many traditions that are considered indispensable parts of our religion, yet there's absolutely no biblical basis for any of them.
Mm-hmm.
And that was certainly a problem for me growing up. And it really showed how much people just sort of took somebody else's authority for it and never really explored the whole ideas themselves.
Yeah, just exactly. What does it mean to be a Christian? What is a Christian? Like that. And there's no encyclopedia. You can look up all the different things. There's just a list of everyone's opinions. And I don't agree with that, but I still think that so-and-so, I'll push this, but I don't believe in that.
Right, and sometimes none of it has anything to do with a Bible, but what theologians are saying. There are probably people who've read, well, even I remember Bart Ehrman was commenting, biblical scholar Bart Ehrman, who taught classes at Princeton, was saying there'd be times he'd ask like an incoming class of biblical scholars, like, how many of you have read the Bible? And only a few hands go up. And they're like,
Yeah.
what?
The complete Bible, like cover to cover.
Yeah. And yet these are students coming in to be, to be biblical scholars. And there are actually a couple of very, in the New Testament, there are a couple of very pro-separation of church and state passages.
Mm-hmm.
Like there was one line where Paul actually says, the government, something to the effect that the government leaders are there because God put them there. Literally.
No, some dumb voters put them there.
Well, I mean, obviously
Yeah.
back in his day,
Yeah.
there were no voting, but, well, I mean, there was some, but anyway. But it was the kind of thing where, like, he really didn't, they really never hinted at, taking over the government and legislating your morality. It's more like person-to-person interaction. And, of course, when religious don't want it to pay taxes, we bring up the passage where he says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's, So it's obviously drawing those distinctions. But it's just something to think about. And I've even heard people say, well, you can justify anything. I've even heard Christians try to argue something about that, against that, saying, well, you can justify anything using the Bible. And I'm like, yeah, don't you think that's a problem?
Yeah.
I mean, I was like,
Very much so.
The complete lack of self-awareness. But yeah, and I kind of gone off on a little bit of a tangent here, but one thing that also has been on my mind lately is one thing that always bothers me in anything, whether it's a religious discussion, political discussion, whatever, is when we get into these "know you're the hypocrite" flame wars.
Mm-hmm.
Because usually, now I'm not saying that pointing out hypocrisy isn't a bad thing. I mean, there are certain people that definitely deserve to be called out on it.
Mm-hmm.
Mitch McConnell. But the thing is, I feel like you can't just drop it on the table like a dead fish and say, no, you did this wrong, and leave it at that.
Yeah.
I think it's sometimes good to, I think it could be used as a conversation starter, like, hey, we got this problem, no one's being consistent on it, let's see how we should really stand on this. And I know when there's a swing of power in politics, we got to go through that, where the people, when somebody's not in power, they say, well, this is what I do and this is what I do, and when they get into power, that's not what they do. And I think some of that is a good reminder. I kind of take that to myself as a good reminder to not say what you do in power, because the view can be very different from there. Where now you're responsible for a lot more things. You might see things in a slightly different light. Now, of course, there are obviously people who will say anything they can to get into power with no intention of following through. But I think sometimes when we get into know you're the hypocrite flame wars, people just kind of throw off their own self-awareness at all, where they have no self-awareness of what the kind of hypocrisy they're going through. And I don't know, it's just my thoughts on that. I prefer to get into more discussions, more nuance, and unfortunately I end up writing like 1,000-word essays in response to one-sentence memes, but
Yeah.
I get a little wordy sometimes, but it's just I try to qualify everything I say, and it gets exhausting sometimes. I can understand why people don't want to get into that, because it can get very exhausting. But one thing I also want to talk about was, coming up we have the 4th of July, our Independence Day.
Yep.
Or as some people have Although, as some people have pointed out, actually the Declaration of Independence, most of the signatures on the Declaration of Independence came on July 2nd, but that's besides the point.
Well, in England, they cross the 4th of July off all calendars. They're still a little bitter over the independence thing. But
Well, I think the King of England back then actually on July 4th wrote in his diary, "Nothing of interest happened today."
yeah, no one paid their taxes today.
But I mean, this is where obviously there's a lot of fun celebrations.
Mhm.
Midsummer, everyone out barbecuing, carnivals and such. But of course, I just kind of wanted to talk about how one thing I see more and more of is this sort of. Now, I think some of it is healthy patriotism. And I have no problem with love of country. I love this country, but I think more and more I'm seeing it sort of tip over into a more dogmatic nationalism, where it's very much like a religion now, and the way people treat the whole idea of country has a lot of parallels to religion. For example, they treat the Constitution like it's a holy book, or the founding fathers like saints, and the symbols of the country are treated with all the reverence of a religious symbol you see sometimes. And I've gotten into a discussion recently with someone who had this really almost supernatural view of the Constitution, where they said, we don't, and his statement was something along the lines of, well, I don't want to talk about anything like progressive, because all the founding fathers had was the Constitution. And I'm thinking, like, what meaningless, unintelligible gibberish is that?
Yeah.
I mean, well, first of all, they didn't have it. They wrote it.
Yeah, good point.
And they all admitted it was flawed and had to amend it only a couple years later. So there are dozens of amendments to prove that the Constitution is not infallible. And we have a whole branch of the government there to simply interpret it and figure out how to apply it. So it's one thing to, and there's also the point where people treat the Constitution as if it's unique.
Yeah,
it's not. Just a couple years later, France had their own constitution, and everybody has a constitution, and all it's there to do is lay out the parameters of the government.
Yeah, even Canada has a constitution.
I mean, everybody has.
Yeah.
Even North Korea has a constitution.
Yeah, strange as it may seem.
Well, part of their constitution is who was it? Their founder is still their president. I can't remember his name though. Kim Il-sung.
Kim Jong-un.
No, his father.
Jong.
I think
Kim Jong-il. Is it?
No, it was that. It was his father that was, I think, the founder. But anyway, that's not the point. But it's just like all the Constitution is it's what constitutes the government. It's what says, okay, this is the role of the government, and this is the guidelines by which we will rule the country. And I think probably one of the best discussions I've read on ideas of a constitution is From the Rights of Man by Thomas Paine.
Yeah,
because he was involved in both the U.S. Constitution and the French Constitution. I think more so with the French Constitution, actually. But I mean, there were numerous problems with our original Constitution.
No, no one would agree to everything. I
Right.
mean, everything was like, well, no, this shouldn't be here, but that should be here.
Yeah, and I think somebody looked. I forget who it was. That there's a story where they looked out the window and said, "Look, the people outside don't care about what's going on in here."
Yep.
Or something like their day-to-day lives won't be affected by what we do in here. Actually, I can't remember exactly how that went. Sorry, never mind. But there's also the point: it didn't abolish slavery. It didn't give women the right to vote for so long.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't give minorities the right to vote. There were just so many things that we had to change, and it was definitely for the better. And that's part of the reason when I get into a discussion about the Constitution and what the Constitution says about something, I make sure I can defend it on its own merits. Like when I defend, the First Amendment or or equal protection under the 14th Amendment, I explain exactly why these things are a good thing to have. I don't say, well, that's in the Constitution and leave it at that. Because the Constitution can be changed. It's not easy, of course, and rightfully so. But it's one thing to always keep in mind is it can be changed, and it has been changed numerous times.
So basically what you're saying is that you believe that the Constitution is a living document, that it should undergo changes the same way that society has undergone?
Yeah, exactly. And it's one of the quotes I liked by Thomas Paine when he said one of the things that Thomas Paine really fought against and what he really hated about monarchies is it left this absurd situation where the living could be ruled by the dead.
Mm-hmm.
And if you think the Constitution is unmovable, you are essentially saying a bunch of dead people who lived 200 years ago still rule your life.
Yeah.
And that's not acceptable anymore. That's the situation every generation faces is different, and they should have the ability to decide for themselves how they should proceed. Now, that's not to say I just crumple up everything the founding fathers did and throw it away. No. I think I do treat their thoughts and actions with some respect. But I don't say it's not an unquestionable authority.
Well, you could say the same thing about Thomas Paine, too. Yeah. I mean, okay, he's ancient. I mean, hundreds of years ago. Here, what significance does he have in today's society? Why don't we just throw everything that he said out the window? And
the thing is what I mean to say is like some of the things he wrote are no longer relevant today, certainly. But there are also many things he wrote that have really withstood the test of time. The same thing with the Constitution. There are some parts we've taken out of the Constitution, but many others that have withstood the test of time because they're good principles that we should hold to. And that's what I mean. And I don't mean, when I say we can change the Constitution, I don't mean to say that so lightly. I don't mean to come across like we should take that lightly. I don't.
Yeah, like just sit down. Oh, let's look at the list here. Oh, yeah, no, we'll check that off.
Yeah, but it's like I don't hold that end, but I also don't hold the other end of the spectrum that so many people seem to have, which is it's in the Constitution and that's it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we shouldn't hold to that extreme either. And
we should get different people's interpretation of the Constitution and even the Bill of Rights.
Right, and I think part of it too is, and I think part of this too is the sort of deification of our founding fathers that everybody has. That everybody thinks they were perfect, and we should just take their word as authority on everything. But obviously, that's not the case, and a lot of them could barely stand to be in the same room with each other.
Yeah, I mean, fist fights broke out when they were discussing things.
Well, actually, that reminds me of. I just remembered something I wanted to say. I heard someone make this observation once. People say that backroom deals are unconstitutional, but that's difficult to say because the Constitution itself was a backroom deal.
Yeah.
It really was. Where people actually pledged secrecy going into the Constitutional Convention.
Yeah. And you look at all the number of people that were in the Constitutional Convention, the first one, but how many actually signed the Constitution?
I don't know
were
that
afraid.
I don't know off the top of my head, but I know what you mean. It's like the people who worked on it was a relatively small number of people.
Yeah.
And it's not like every U.S. citizen got a chance to see it before it was approved. I mean, if that were to happen today, the process would have dragged on so much longer. And making sure everyone had it. Of course, in today's mass media, we can do that. Back then, they couldn't.
Yeah.
And again, that's just another example of how we have to do things differently today.
40 people signed the Constitution.
40 people signed it.
39 delegates and 1 lawyer.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But yeah, only 40 people signed it. So.
But a lawyer isn't a people, so.
And of course, the people who were there weren't perfect by any standards. I mean, you had, people like Thomas Jefferson that everybody loves, but he had slaves and probably fathered a few children through them.
Mm-hmm.
Well, actually, a lot of them had slaves, and you might say, well, that was just the time frame, but no, there were people like my hero Thomas Paine, who was already very much an outspoken opponent of it, and there were places where there was already moves towards getting rid of slavery.
And from various factions, not just the North, but some people in the South too.
It was somewhat factional, yeah. So it's just, I think you can sometimes lose sight of the fact that they were people.
Yeah.
I mean, that's as funny as that sounds sometimes. There are times you can actually really lose sight of the fact that various people throughout history are just that, people. Actually, part of the reason I love the movie Downfall was because they depicted the Nazis as human beings, which has actually made them that much scarier to me.
Yeah. Well, there was a movie called Das Boot, or Das Boot, which is basically meant the submarine, and it was a film from the Germans' perspective, and the people in this one particular submarine. And, they could have been wearing an American sailor's uniform. They could have been wearing anyone, but it just goes to prove that they weren't necessarily evil. They were in a war. They thought that their side was the right side because of propaganda and everything. And it actually, for me, it did humanize the average German soldier or sailor. Not necessarily someone like Hitler or Himmler or any of the SS people, but the average guy off the street that was grabbed and said, "Okay, you're going to serve." They were just people.
Yeah, it's not to the point where you'd want to forgive them. Necessarily, but it's just sort of it kind of gives you a deeper perspective on what happened. And like the same thing with any of the founding fathers of the country or any of the great people through history, where I know, I try not to get too attached because I know there's probably had their own dark secrets.
Mm-hmm.
It's because they were just people. And the other thing I would say is, unfortunately, you get so many people treating the symbols of our country like with so much reverence that they're almost like holy relics. And even if you try to do something patriotic, if you do it the wrong way, people get it all upset about it. Even people are big flag wavers, but they do something a little wrong, and everybody gets all upset about, oh, you did it the wrong way.
Yeah.
And it's almost seems ridiculous to me.
I totally agree.
Especially when it's like, come on, guys, let's chill out a little bit here. And I think and one thing I think that's problematic about it too is it really creates this whole what they call American exceptionalism. Like we never do anything wrong, and it allows us to ignore a lot of the darker points of our history, and it also and not just our history but ongoing today, and we just get so full of ourselves we don't care about the rest of the country or the rest of the world.
It's only about you.
Yeah,
it's only about me.
And I feel that same way sometimes when people talk, like if I say stuff like this, well, people would like, well, you're being disrespectful to veterans or any of past and present. And actually sometimes I try to get a more complete view of it because we just think about, they say the veterans are just, serving us, but they've served a lot of people overseas as well. And in the same token, in the same turn, there are people overseas who have served us and worked together with us. How would have World War II gone without the French resistance?
Yeah.
Or the Russians holding out at Stalingrad, or any of those various other people we've depended on throughout history through these wars. So sometimes I think some of the soldiers didn't just die for America; they died for the entire world.
Yeah.
I think that could honor them a whole lot more than just a more self-centered. They just died for us.
But what about the conscripted, the drafted people? Should we give them the same reverence as someone who volunteered for it?
That's an interesting question, and I don't think there's a good answer to that. Because this is what I get sometimes is volunteer service. It depends on why they're volunteering, because I've known my fair share of people who have gone into the military for less than charitable reasons. Mm-hmm. And whether they're like, oh, I want to go out in there and kill some of them foreigners or something.
Yeah.
I've known people who did that. So it's hard for me to make just a blanket statement about this because it depends on the individual. It really does, and then I think it's.
Well, I mean, I actually enlisted in the Army during the Vietnam War, 1962. Now, if I'd have waited long enough, undoubtedly I would have been drafted. But if you volunteered and you enlisted, I would get my choice of either where I was going to be stationed at, or I would have a choice of my MOS, which is my military occupational specialty. And I was getting into electronics at the time, and I said, no, I want to go to school for that. So I was guaranteed that I would get advanced electronics training. And I should have had to, flip a coin as to whether or not where I was going to be stationed, and I sort of lucked out. But I wasn't looking to go out and, I want to kill those commies.
Right. There's always that where, the common joke is the people who go enlist in the National Guard or something.
Yeah.
Or just some place where they, and I don't mean for that to come across as a blanket statement either. It's just like, you have to think. It's so hard to make blanket statements about this because of that reason. It's they might have different motivations. I mean, now obviously the people who want to go fight because they believe in the cause and it's for the betterment of everybody. Yes, they deserve to be treated with the utmost respect.
But also you have to understand the other view, and that is, I don't want to die, and I don't particularly want to go out and kill someone else either. So, I mean, if it's legitimate, the feeling that way, I really don't want to kill people like that. I'll serve in some other form, but I just don't put a rifle in my hand. Then I can understand that too.
And it kind of reminds me of the one time people were criticizing President Obama for he was on some diplomatic tour, kind of in close proximity to Memorial Day, and everyone was getting upset about that. And I'm like, why not spend Memorial Day making sure we don't have to fight again? Exactly. It's the thing. It's like. That's one of the things about, when I think about the veterans who've come, the people who've died before us, is I don't think they died so we'd have to do it too. I think they want a peaceful future for us. And I think that's the best way to honor soldiers of the past is to try to make a peaceful world, the best and most peaceful world that we can. That's what you always have to look to. You have to look to the future. Right. If me serving now helps protect my future and the other people's future, then, okay, that's a worthwhile cause. Yeah, and I've read a few writings of the people in the early part of this country who said, we've got to do this fight now so our children won't have to. Yeah. And I think the people who have that attitude, I hold in the highest respect. I mean, you always have to worry about people like Kim Jong-il and of North Korea, people like that rocking the boat. Never maybe intentionally trying to start a war, but doing something so provocative that someone takes it the wrong way. Right. Well, I think there is, some of them just go on power trips, like North Korea. They just want to try to act all, they've got it in their head that they are God, basically. Well, actually, I should say the leader does. The people of North Korea, I feel very sorry for, and I wish there was something more we could do to help them. Yeah. But they, I've heard people say that if North Korea should start some armed conflict with any of the surrounding countries, including the U.S., that there is going to be a lot of North Korean civilians heading to China. And China doesn't want, people crossing the line. So how will China act? Will China say, look, North Korea, we were your friend, but you're getting a little mouthy right now, so you better cut it out, or... Yeah, they probably wouldn't accept... They don't accept North Korean refugees right now. No. So I don't think they would do that in a time of war. Although it's hard to be too critical because, let's face it, we haven't been the most welcoming of Cuban refugees either. Yeah. Now, we're not as diplomatically close to Cuba as China is to North Korea, but it's still, which actually would be all the more reason for us to take in Cuban refugees. And they've lived under a dictatorship for so long. That's
Yeah.
their quality of life is terrible. They just
Well over 50 years. They've got, there's no new cars there. I mean,
right.
it looks like a used car lot.
Yeah, and that's just like one representative of their problems, where it's just they're so stagnated and they've just been isolated from the outside world. And while we could say all sorts of things against Fidel Castro and his family, I mean, obviously Fidel Castro just died, but is the family that has ruled that country, it's you kind of look at, what can we do to help the people?
Well, I mean, wasn't it the Sandinistas that were in power before, and Castro decided he was going to start a revolution because they didn't like the previous ruler, and then all of a sudden he became the ruler that people didn't like.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I've seen that narrative a couple times in these sort of revolution movies or stories where sometimes, like, and actually this was part of a plot in the Hunger Games, where the person they were setting up in charge after they get rid of the president was just as bad.
Yeah.
And sometimes you do get that, or it's just a different. You get people just in it for themselves, and you end up with not what you wanted, which is part of the reason. Like I reject some of this revolution that people talk about today in America. Sometimes I'm like, no, you'll probably end up with either the same, at absolute best, you'll end up at the same spot you started. Yeah. So I think you just have to work to improve the system you're in, at least here. I mean, obviously elsewhere, like if you're living under a dictatorship, obviously things aren't going to get better for you unless unless you completely overthrow that government.
Well, I guess that we're running a little short on time. What do we got? 2 minutes left? Something like that. We've got 2 minutes right now. So I want to thank you for tuning in, and come back the second Tuesday next month, and we'll be here again. Anything else?
No, I will not. We may have a pre-recorded show for you next time. I will not be here because of the 4th of July holiday. My hometown is moving its borough council meeting. And obviously, as I said in a couple of shows ago, try to get involved in your local government as much as possible.
But what has the 4th of July got to do with our next show? I mean, that's nowhere near that. I mean, okay, celebrate the 4th of July, that anti-British holiday, but that's okay. We're not bitter about it.
Yeah, but
it's okay. I won't mention the name, but my favorite restaurant that I go to a lot. I was down there the other day, and I saw that they had a little sign in the window saying, "We're closed from July the 2nd to July the 9th. And all I can think is, what am I going to do for food? I said, I suppose I've got to buy some groceries and cook it myself. But, someone's taking a whole week off for the 4th of July. Now, I take time off for Benedict Arnold's birthday. It's in February, but
most of the time I have to work. But
we'll see you, everyone, and we're going bye-bye. Thanks for tuning in.